Greetings, traveler. The other day, a friend of mine asked me a D&D DMing question. He said that one of the players in his group is so much stronger compared to everybody else that it's making the group feel uncomfortable, it's making them feel like they're not outputting enough damage, it's making the overpowered player feel like there's not enough challenge in the game, and it made my friend as a DM feel that he was having trouble dealing with the situation in an elegant and simple way so that everybody in the group feels like they're having fun. So today what I want to do is talk about the advice I gave him and how I deal with that situation. Talk about the hard way of dealing with this traditionally, and then share my easy way of dealing with this kind of situation. So my name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry, making video games for over 14 years now, and I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons for about 30 years now. So mostly as a dungeon master. So in my time, I've seen a couple tough DMing situations, but I think with all the resources we have from the Dungeon Master's Guides and all the other books out there, we can be quite creative with our solutions. So to elaborate on my friend's situation a little bit, he was dealing with a player who was playing a sorcerer quite well. So well, in fact, that his damage output was 5 to 10 times more than any other players. And the other players were also, fighters and wizards and so on. So thinking class-wise, it would seem that the player should have more or less the same damage output. But it seemed that this one player was just completely out-damaging everybody else, to the point where there was basically not enough enemies for the other players to fight and enjoy the combat with. And for the overpowered player, he was just obliterating everything in sight. So for him as well, instead of having a nice, challenging, satisfying session, he was just breezing through every encounter, leading to a session that was not very fun for him. So traditionally, having spoken with other dungeon masters over the years about this situation, often this kind of approach comes up in the conversation. One is to somehow limit the sorcerer's power. So if the sorcerer is using a splat book, by the way, if you don't know what splat books are, they are basically all books that are not in the core 3 in every edition. So it's not the Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual. So any book other than those typically introduces stronger options than those core 3. Not always, but usually that's the case. So players who are looking for this edge in combat, for this extra powerful mechanics, might use abilities and classes and so on from those books. So sometimes the overpowered player uses material from those books, and since the other players are not using them, he ends up feeling overpowered. So one approach is to ban material from that book and hope that the overpowered player will instead have to use material from the core books, so he won't be overpowered anymore. That approach has the problem of basically having the player turn back on his options, right? After the character is complete and the player who made the character is happy with his choices, then he has to basically go back on those choices, and even though he's excited to play this character, essentially the DM says, well, no, now you can't play it. I don't think this is an ideal situation personally, and in my friend's case, he couldn't take that option because other players were using material from that same book as well. So, and they didn't turn up overpowered. So saying that book is banned in our session wouldn't be a very elegant or convenient solution in his case. Other ways for ending up overpowered is either the player who is overpowered has a lot of knowledge about the game. He just knows what the good combinations are, what the good spells and abilities are, or just how to navigate the game better, and naturally through knowledge he ends up being more powerful. Or conversely, he's playing together with a lot of novice players, so of course they wouldn't know all the nooks and crannies of the rules of the game, so they wouldn't be as strong as that player. The approach in that case would be to either, again, ban the spells and abilities that make the player powerful, or forcibly make the players that are not overpowered take different options for their classes. So that would mean that the dungeon master or the overpowered player would help them choose their abilities better and optimize the build and so on. That is another approach. Personally, I've seen that approach lead to a situation where the players that had their abilities and so on chosen for them end up playing a different character than they imagined. And not just a different character, but different play style too, to end up being competitive or on par or any of that stuff. So that is another approach that has not been ideal from what I observed. And what's another situation where we're having trouble dealing with overpowered players, or rather, how to limit their power. Yes. So the third case where, sometimes DMs feel obliged to do something about the overpowered player is to, let's say that the overpowered player can do a lot of fire damage, for example. One approach is to create a lot of monsters that are resistant or immune to fire damage, fire elementals and so on. So that approach definitely exists, but again, it has the opposite effect of what's intended. So it's good for the other players because they feel like they're on par with this very strong player now. The DM thinks that this is a good approach since everybody's on a level playing field now, but it feels very bad for the player who has this working against him, because it feels like all the effort he put into researching abilities and reading all the books and coming up with this strong build is basically taken away. Even though he knows that his character should feel pretty effective, it ends up being not effective at all. And if this happens in one combat encounter, it's so-so. But if this keeps happening, if all he can do is high fire damage and he comes up with fire-resistant monsters left and right, it's not gonna be fun for him, and that's it's kind of going to affect the session, I think, overall. So I think these are the main cases where trying to limit that situation can backfire. Not necessarily, but it is possible for all this to backfire. And as I was talking to my friend about this situation, he said, how would you deal with this player without falling into all these pitfalls rather? And I said, well, there's many solutions to this, but a simple one would be a mathematical one, I thought. So if I was in this situation and I had one player who has, 5 or 10 times the damage output over everybody else in the group, what I would do is introduce monsters into every encounter that need that much damage to be taken out. So that would mean that, for example, if the next encounter is a group of goblins and they all have very few hit points, and the player with a high damage can take them all out in one spell or something, then introducing a few enemies that have 5 or 10 times the hit points mixed in with the normal monsters of that encounter would essentially force the high damage player to focus on those monsters, since he would have to do that anyway to get the combat moving forward. And then my friend asked, well, what if the high power player targets the weak monsters instead, and he leaves the other players to deal with those very high hit point monsters that they can't deal with? Well, in that case, I thought that maybe there's something about the smaller monsters, the ones with the fewer hit points, that the player can't deal with. So this is a good usage, I thought, of the damage resistance or damage absorption thing, or simply making those other monsters more accessible to other players, either through range or through positioning in combat and so on. Let's say the high output player has I can only do that high damage in very close range, then the weaker monsters would be further away, so they would be more easily accessible by, I don't know, archers and so on, or the other way around, right? If the player can deal this high damage at long range, maybe the weaker monsters would come up close. So basically, divide the enemies in the encounter in such a way where they play towards the strengths of each character, essentially making the high damage output not an unbalancing factor in the whole encounter, but making it necessary to clear that encounter. So in other words, making it necessary to have both a player with a very high damage output and players that have the abilities, well, that the rest of the group has. So just in that very simple, very elegant way, the player with the high damage output can feel satisfied because he can use his abilities to the most and see the results of his effort, and the other players don't feel irrelevant. In combat, they are doing something that only they can do. And my friend thought, I didn't think of that. That does sound like a solution, and he didn't report back to me with this problem, so I suppose this handled his situation. But here's a bonus story. That kind of got me thinking, why don't I ever come up in this situation where one of my players is way stronger than everybody else in the group? And I was thinking about it, and I remembered back to probably my favorite piece of advice from, I think it was, I forget which book it was from, but basically it says that a character sheet is basically a wish list for that character. And that means that if on a character sheet you see a lot of skills, a lot of time invested by the player on figuring out how many skills he can get and how he can get his skills as effective as possible, then that's kind of like saying that player wants to use his skills a lot in the game. Conversely, if you see a player who has very high damage output, that means that, or tactical combat feats like disarming and tripping and all that stuff, it kind of means that, well, that player wants to do some disarm attacks and some trip attacks, otherwise he wouldn't have chosen all these abilities. So just by observing the character sheet of every player, you can kind of get a glimpse on what they would like to see their character do. And I think the fun part of DMing in a sense here is to come up with suggestions, in your mind of what situation would be fun for this kind of player, what challenge would be fun to overcome for this player, and session after session and encounter after encounter, see the player's reaction to the challenges you present. If he seems bored, perhaps try a different approach. If he seems like he's having fun, perhaps variations on the same. But I think that's a really good source of fun for the player. So because I was taking this approach with designing the encounters, basically trying to come up with a situation that was custom built for this particular group, for this particular set of abilities they have, then I never really had the problem of one player outperforming everybody else, or one player not being relevant to the encounter based on their skills and abilities and so on. In every encounter there was something for everybody to do. And of course, a good rule of thumb for me here is to have at least 3 ways for an encounter to be solved. So through experience, I found out that perhaps there is a way that I imagine the encounter is going to go. So the archer is going to do this, the wizard is going to do that, and they're going to defeat the encounter like this. So even though I have this image in my mind, very often players do very, very different things. So over the years, I tried having multiple ways for the encounter to be solved. Typically one damage-based, one skill-based, and one unique to that situation. So I guess you could call it environmental or situational. And this way, players don't feel pigeonholed into doing this one strategy that I have in my mind to defeat the encounter. Perhaps they can do a mix of 2 or 3, or just focus on one of them and work together towards doing the environmental one, for example. And by the way, by environmental, I mean perhaps there is an unstable ceiling in that encounter, and if that ceiling collapses and falls on the enemies, then the players automatically win the encounter. But of course, that's not a one action thing. It needs some coordination. You need to knock out all the supports and then pull the ceiling and do all magic and stuff like that. There is some coordination necessary. So either way the players want to go about this, I think it should be solvable in multiple ways. Anyway, and because I designed my encounters this way, no player was ever left out of the fun, or felt that he's basically soloing the encounter while everybody else is just waiting for him to finish combat so the adventure can go on. And that's just a testament to how powerful this technique is, and how much you can learn, not just talking to players and asking them what is fun for them, but just simply looking at character sheets and seeing what's written over there, what selection of spells, what combination of abilities, what weapons, what skills the player is focusing on. And basically by doing that, you also have the amazing advantage where it kind of gives you hints for what to put in the adventures, which sometimes is a headache for dungeon masters, right? You feel like you need to reinvent the wheel with every adventure, and you think, okay, what is it going to be this time? What do I have to do? But if you look at the character sheets, you see that, okay, this player has, I don't know, maybe 6 skills that he's good at. Maybe this session we can focus on 2 or 3 of them and explore the rest in the next session, or different combinations in the other sessions, and so on. So all in all, I think that's a fantastic piece of advice. It has helped me a lot, and if it's useful to at least one other person out there, one other traveler, I will be super happy. Anyway, that's it for today. I know this is a rather tactical topic, so if you have a situation that you're struggling with, or something that I can help you with, perhaps some advice, feel free to let me know, and I'll try to advise any way I can. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have fun.